Hello everyone. This is a presentation designed to give an overview of standards-based grading and formative assessments. A lot of the information from this presentation comes from a variety of sources, most notably the November 2011 issue of Educational Leadership, Robert Marzano's Formative Assessment and Standards-Based Grading, and a pretty practical blog by Sean Cornely on his and his school's journey implementing standards-based grading. And there's also information from a variety of other videos and articles, and if you're interested in seeing those or learning more about this topic, there are many links to those other resources at our wiki space. And some of the essential questions that this presentation tackles is: what is the purpose of a grade? How can we use grades to show what students know? How can we use assessments to show what students know? And then one of our next steps, we don't really address it in this presentation, but our next steps include the essential question: how can we make changes to our grading and assessment systems in order to create accurate, meaningful grades and improve student learning? So my personal involvement in this comes from situations like this. If you're a teacher, you might recognize this scene. This is actually the last day of school. Students have just finished a presentation, and that's me adding in the points into the grade book, and the students are gathered around to watch me do my magic and create their final grade after I've added all their points and divided and averaged. And I looked at this picture, and it made me think that I looked kind of like a wizard there, adding in all kinds of secret ingredients to my magical cauldron while confused students stood around waiting for the results to see what their final score would be. And it seems like grades shouldn't be like this. That it shouldn't be so mysterious and abstract. And then that made me think more about what the purpose of a grade is. And right now, I use my grades for a few different things. I use it to report student understanding. I use it to motivate my students to try harder. I reward students for positive behavior with grades, and I'll admit it, I sometimes punish students for their negative behavior with their grade. And the problem with that, with using a grade to do all these different things, is the grade becomes less and less accurate as a measure of what the students know, what the students can do. And it's kind of based on a traditional grading method, and those traditional grading practices come from a desire to select talent, to be able to differentiate between students who learn and students who don't learn. But if that's what I'm doing with my grade, I got to think about what's the purpose, what's my purpose as an educator? Is my job to select talent or develop it? And I know a lot of teachers like the idea of the bell curve for their grades. A few F's at the bottom, a few A's at the top, and a whole bunch of students in the middle. And the problem with that kind of thinking is that a bell curve is meant to represent a random distribution of events when nothing intervenes. Well, that's not what happens in the classroom, though. In the classroom, we're intervening all the time. We're developing talent. So our grade book should look less like a bell curve and more like an incline, I would hope, if I'm doing my job, and the students are doing their part. So if our job is to develop talent, one of the ways to record that development is with standards-based grading. And this is a quotation from Sean Cornely's frequently asked questions page on his blog about standards-based grading, and I'll give you a few seconds to read through this before moving on. So with standards-based grading, the focus really is on what the students know, what the students learn, and this chart kind of highlights some of the differences between traditional grading practices and standards or skills-based grading practices. With traditional grading practices, students earn points in a variety of assignments. Those points are added up, and divided, and their final grade is determined with an average or a total. Students earn their grade by, or raise their grade by earning more points, and all assignments have meaning because they all are worth points. And students keep working until they have enough points to earn that acceptable grade. However, with standards-based grading, students are given opportunities to learn and develop proficiency on a variety of skills. They have to show proficiency on skills instead of earning the points. Their proficiency determines their final grade, not how many points they've earned. Students raise their grade by demonstrating increased learning. All the assignments have meaning because they give students opportunities to learn and practice before their proficiency is evaluated and reevaluated. And students keep working until they have demonstrated acceptable proficiency on target learning goals. And I like this quotation. This comes out of the educational leadership issue that I mentioned earlier. Susan M. Brookhart says, "Standards-based grading is based on the principle that grades should convey how well students have achieved standards. In other words, grades are not about what students earn, they are about what students learn." And I like that as a teacher. I like the idea of focusing on what students learn, but then the question becomes, what do we want our students to learn? And we have our standards, we have Common Core standards, we have competencies, so we do have guidance in this area. It's not like we have to pick them out of thin air, and if we're working on vertical alignment, we can certainly choose them strategically. We just need to make that choice and decide which standards we're going to focus on. So once we've chosen our standards, how can our grading system show what students know? And one of the first things we would need to do is develop some sort of generic proficiency scale. A lot of people who support standards-based grading also support the idea of using a 4-point proficiency scale like the one shown here, rather than the 100-point scale. We'll talk more about that later, but basically students would receive scores on this proficiency scale for each standard, and that score would continuously be updated as a student demonstrated increased understanding or student retested, or so that they could be reevaluated. And the generic form, the language would get much more specific for each individual standard that we decide to focus on. And as we'll talk about later, this pattern helps us develop our formative assessments and use our formative assessments for more meaningful feedback. And one of the things I noticed right away when I saw this was, oh wow, a 4-point scale, that's very much like GPA. That'll be easy to make grades out of this 4-point scale. But upon further reading, this 4-point proficiency scale does not equal the 4.0 scale. So that's one little potential misunderstanding. The writers, the people who talk about standards-based grading, talk about developing, they understand the necessity of turning a proficiency scale score into an omnibus grade, and they offer a chart, something like this. This one is from Marzano and Rick Wormelli. This one shows how to transfer a proficiency score to a grade. And one of the things I noticed right away is that a 3 is not a B, a 3 is an A minus. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. If your target objective is a 3, like they say it should be with proficiency scales, and if a student meets the target learning goal, then why shouldn't that student be getting an A or an A minus? And with a scale like this, it enables teachers to have conversations like, you got a C, well, in a traditional scale, we would have to say you got a C because you don't have all your points. But with a scale like this, we'd be able to say things like, you got a C because you reached these proficiency levels for these standards or skills. So the focus is on learning, which I appreciate. So then with the focus on learning, what does a grade book look like? And one of the articles from the issue of Education Leadership I mentioned offers a chart similar to the one here, where a grade book is a list of standards or a list of measurement topics or a list of skills that we want our students to master, and then we record the student's score. And in our grade books there should be a way to record the original score and also record the student's growth. Here the original score shown in blue, the growth shown in light blue, and of course this is just 4 items listed here. Our grade books will have many more than this. It'll have the standards we decide to focus on in our courses. One of the important things to note is that the final score listed here, this score is not an average of the student's original 1.5 and the student's final 3.5. The score that we record in our gradebook that actually affects the grade should be the score that the score that demonstrates what the students actually know or what the students understand at the end of learning. So this score can continually change throughout the semester or throughout the grading period, and the scores here are not averaged. One of the articles talk about averaging scores, comparing that to a running coach. You wouldn't have a running coach average his or her athletes' practice runs with his or her athletes' running time during the race. You wouldn't do that. It doesn't make sense to record practice and average it with the final score. Instead, you just look at what the student can do at the end of learning, or at retesting and reevaluating what they can learn. So with these scores, this student's average was 2.75, and with the conversion table that I mentioned earlier, that would be a grade of a B. So this is the point where I am right now. I haven't started standards-based grading in my classes. I'm curious about it. I see that there might be some issues, some problems with it, but I also see that it has a lot of promise, a lot of potential, and I want to give it a try. So that's where I am. I'm curious, and I want to try it. However, I also recognize that it is kind of complicated, and it is a lot of work. It's not something that's going to happen easily. And sometimes I ask myself, well, can't we just stick to the 100-point scale? That's easy. That's what I learned. That's what I grew up with. Why do we need to change our grades anyway? What's the point? And then I get reminded with this kind of thinking, I would kind of be going back to this situation where my grades make sense to me, but they only make sense to me. My students don't really get much out of them. My students can't use my grades to learn. My grades maybe won't even make sense to teachers or counselors, because they're just an addition of points and an average of points, and they don't make much sense, and it's not really clear what students need to know or learn to do better. All they know is they need more points. So that's what kind of pushes me to continue to want to try standards-based grading, even though I know it might be a little difficult at first. So moving on to our next essential question, how can we use assessments to show what students know? And one of the things that comes up again and again as you're reading about standards-based grading is formative assessment, assessment for learning. And formative assessment is not any particular test, it's a process where students are given feedback multiple times during the learning process, and that gives teachers an opportunity to adjust their instruction based on what the students need, and it gives students many opportunities to demonstrate what they know, and to know what they know and know what they don't know. It's an assessment that guides students toward learning goals. And there is a lot of research that supports formative assessment, especially for low-achieving students. It helps students reach high standards and raise their standards because of the power of feedback, positive feedback that tells students what they need to do to get better. And formative assessments, you might have heard about it a lot, but to be clear about where they come from, they are teacher-designed, externally developed assessments. They just don't meet the characteristics of formative assessment. Many test publishers, they'll try to repackage old assessments and give it to us again as a formative assessment, and oftentimes those just do not work as well as assessments designed by teachers for their students. So as we think about the process for developing formative assessment, um, it'll include many more steps than is given in this overview, but it'll also include these 5 fundamental steps, which is choosing learning goals, developing our scales, designing the assessment, tracking progress, and then using that feedback to generate grades eventually. The first step, choosing our learning goal. It's important to have a few learning goals with formative assessments. We don't want to overwhelm ourselves or overwhelm students with a plethora of learning goals. Our learning goals should be standards or skill based. They can be related to critical competencies. Our standards can be based on power standards, the most essential learning that we want our students to participate in. After we've chosen our standard, we need to unwrap it and figure out what exactly the students need to be able to do, what do students need to know in order to meet this standard. And after we've done that, we can develop our scale. And before I mentioned the 4-point scale, many researchers suggest using that 4-point scale. It's much more reliable than the 100-point scale. It gives students a lot more hope than the 100-point scale. If you get a 0 on the 4-point scale, you can still come back from that. If you get a 0 on the 100-point scale, many students just give up. And there are other reasons why it's more reliable. It's easier for groups to reach a consensus about how to define and measure proficiency, and it's a lot easier to develop. And each learning goal can use the generic proficiency scale as a starting point and then develop more specific standard or skill language depending on what we want students to learn. And one of the things I found most interesting is on the 4-point scale, you would begin with your target learning goal as the 3 score, and as I mentioned earlier, the 3 score would be that student's A. So again, here's the generic proficiency scale that you saw earlier. Then you get to designing your formative assessment. And I like this quotation from Creating Student-Friendly Tests. This also comes from the November 2011 issue of Educational Leadership. A valid test should cover the main topics, concepts, and skills teachers taught during the time preceding the test. In creating good test items, we should address not only what was taught, but also how it was taught. And this is a big part of the reason why outside tests made for us don't really work. The tests that we make for ourselves and for our own students work a lot better because the test we make reflects how we taught. So the teaching and the testing is much more correlated. So as you're designing your formative assessment, remember that an assessment doesn't have to be just multiple choice. It can be short answer, essay, presentation, probing questions, a ticket out the door. It's really up to us. So as we're designing our assessments, we should include items that assess students' proficiency at each level on our scale, so that some questions would be at the 1.0 level if they got that question right. Some questions would be at the 2.0 level if they got that question right. Some would be at the 3.0 level, some would be at the 4.0 level. And if we design our assessments this way, it really makes it pretty easy to tell students and ourselves what level of proficiency our students have. Then we can track our student progress on our different learning goals, and the teachers can record progress in a way something like this, where you show students' initial score with a standard, their final score with a standard, and this score here is always in flux with every little assessment, every ticket out the door, every multiple choice or short answer or essay that you give students. This score can change. It doesn't become an average of all their scores. It becomes, the more data you receive from students, the more accurate your score for the student's performance on that standard can be. And it's also important to have students record their progress using something like this reflective learning progress chart from Literacy TA, or we can develop another type of student progress chart. But when students record their own progress, it really gives them power over their learning goals and helps them see what they need to do next in order to improve. And then we get to the point where we need to move our proficiency scale score into an actual grade or a letter grade. And then what we end up with is a system where grades are actually reflecting learning, and grades are based on our evaluation of students' proficiency with all these different standards. In order to improve grades, students realize there really is no way around it. They just have to learn more. And this actually does go in well with our gradebook, our current gradebook. I know we have grade categories in the English department where some of our grade is made up of reading standards, some of it's writing standards, some is listening and speaking, and this process does not go against that. We can still weight different sections of our grades, but instead of having things like, for reading, Chapter 1 reading log or vocabulary quiz number 3, instead of those kinds of items being in our grade book, we would have, for example, understanding the plot, providing accurate summaries, and these would be standards or items or skills or competencies that would be listed in our grade books, and the scores would be changing over time, so that the student's entire grade is made up of how they performed on standards that we believe that are important for passing our courses. That is pretty much the overview of formative assessments and standards-based grading. Our next steps, that's up to us as a department. Is this something we're interested in? Do we want to try some of this, all of this? I know I certainly want to give it a try. I don't know if I'll crash and burn, but I definitely want to see if it helps students the way it seems like it would help students. Thanks very much for listening, and have a great day.